that time, 12:30. Welcome back. Today we're beginning the discussion of the chapter in your text referred to as, or titled, Beyond the Appalachians, 1815 to 1860, authored by Carville, Earle. Carville, Earle, in this textbook. Okay, thank you. And this particular text is, as I maybe have mentioned, was first published in 1987. Okay, and then the edition that you all have is the second edition, 2001. I remember when this was brand new, and I'm really excited. Okay, the original edition actually had better maps. It had some different articles, for the most part the same sort of scheme of articles, but by some different writers, different authors. This one in particular, though, Carville Earle's was one of the originals, and it hadn't changed very much. It's a pretty substantial piece of work. It is largely a chapter about the first part of the 19th century, and it is, the title is unfortunately not very telling of what the subject is, but it's about the development of the regional economies of the various regions of the United States leading up to the Civil War. Okay, so I wanted to begin by just maybe, and we're going to spend 2 days, I think, on this topic. I wanted to begin by asking you, just get sort of a poll, and there aren't any right or wrong answers necessarily. But, how would you describe the process of economic development in a country? And it doesn't have to be the United States. It could be any other country. It could be perhaps, let's say, a developing world country today. Let's say perhaps in Latin America, say Honduras, or perhaps Brazil, or maybe somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa, like Senegal, or South Africa. How do you gauge economic development, and what are some measures of economic development? First of all, what do we usually point to?
Change in quality of life.
Changes in quality of life. How do we measure quality of life? Good point. We have indices now, right, on quality of life. And it's usually a multiple, it includes lots of different variables. What are some of those variables?
Mortality rates.
Birth rates, mortality rates, demographic stuff. Okay.
Per capita.
Things like life expectancy for sure, and infant mortality rates. Okay.
Per capita income.
Per capita income, yeah, real basic economic measures. Per capita income, or gross domestic product, gross domestic product per capita. More recently, there are more precise sorts of measures, that take into account the variability of currencies, because you can't really measure one currency against another. So things like GDP per capita, purchasing power parity, so you kind of balance out those currency exchange rates to try to get a decent measure. But there are a lot of ways that we're kind of interested in understanding economic development. Why are we even interested in understanding development? I know it is. I didn't bring those chips. Darn it! If I'd laid out those chips, you'll be jumping at these answers. I know, right? So, what are some ideas here? Why would we bother to measure stuff like this?
Improve the future.
Pardon?
Improve the future.
Yeah, to make life better for everyone, right? Is that what is the primary driver of development? What has been the primary driver of development in a very broad sense? Let's just say making people have more free time, allowing people to live longer and healthier lives, happier lives. What are we getting at here? Yeah.
Technological advancement.
Technological advancement allows that. Okay, so how does technological advancement occur? What is technological advancement? How does technology get better?
We learn how to use it.
Well, some of you are probably engineering students, aren't you? Right? No?
Innovation and
Business students? Yeah, innovation. How does innovation work? What's the basis of innovation?
demand.
Okay, yeah, demand for it. And I would really like to have a cell phone that stayed charged a whole week. All right? So I really would like to have that, but it just hadn't happened yet, I don't think.
Make people's lives easier.
What are the things that drive the processes that make people's lives easier? What are those processes? What is the impetus for improving technology? What is the impetus for making things better in the past? Money? As in how? If I came up with a battery that lasted a month rather than 36 hours, I could make a lot of money on it, couldn't I? Right? So I need to either learn some electrical engineering or hire some electrical engineers, right?
Right.
And then how can I put them in a laboratory so they can play with all the best new stuff, right? And they can develop new technology, and I'm going to hire the very best, smartest ones, more creative ones too, not just the smartest, but the most creative, the ones that think out of the box. And I want to get this, this group going so they can develop this product. Ultimately, why?
So you can sell it and make money.
So I can make money. So I can make a lot of money. Right? Capitalism, folks, drives development. It's all about capitalism. Right? Innovations happen because people make money from them, make profits. The government doesn't do it. Okay, trust me. So this is a process that we're going to be looking at, thinking about this whole issue of development. So from 1815 to 1860, we're interested in how the regions that are developing in this new country, the United States, what's driving the change? That's kind of our basis for this question. Now, your author here, Carville Earle, has some ideas about that, and you're going to learn about it. So these ideas are have been fairly well received. Okay, and this guy he passed away a number of years ago, but at an unfortunately young age. But he had some fairly deep and substantial ideas about the process that occurred. All right, now, forgive my unique sort of PowerPoints. I'll show you some more standard fonts, but some of you have seen this kind of thing before, so you can trust me. First of all, this particular chapter is done by Carville Earle, who was an historical geographer at Louisiana State University. He specialized for the most part in agricultural production, and what I'm wanting to show you here is that the country grew phenomenally in this first half of the 19th century, that by 1860 the United States economy was number 3 behind Great Britain and France. And the focus here is on a period when the population of the United States grew from, at a level from its initial, let's say, 1780 level, it grew 15 times in terms of population and 30 times in terms of urban population. Now, perhaps if you know a little bit about colonial America, in 1780, what was the percent urban in the United States in 1780? It was less than 5%. it was like somewhere between around 3% of the population lived in the cities. And cities themselves were, a big metropolis would have been about the size of Stillwater. Right? New York City was actually smaller than Stillwater, I believe, in 1780, in terms of population. But for the most part, we're looking at a developing country. And the development process is what we're looking at. But we want to know why it's developing, how it's developing, okay? So this is kind of a case study of the United States during its formative stages of economic development before industrialization. The Industrial Revolution in the United States began in earnest after the Civil War, during or after the Civil War. Most people will say the 1870s is sort of a period of the first industrial development, and then we continue to be industrial for a century or so, until we moved into this period that people refer to as post-industrial, dominated by the service economies. But the industrialization of the country was something that's pretty easily seen, pretty measurable, in that the vast majority of people began to be living in cities by 1920, I believe it was. The majority of Americans living in cities. 50 years prior to that, the number of people who are making a living through manufacturing, through what we call the secondary sector of the economy, begins to grow. And that would, the proportion of people employed in manufacturing, or generally the secondary sector of the economy, would continue to grow until the mid-20th century. Okay. So this is a period in which we're looking at before that emergence of industrialization. So what was the economy like before industrialization? It was all agricultural, right? Everybody was pretty much a farmer, right? Most everybody was engaged somehow in agriculture. Now here at OSU, we have sayings like, well, if you're not, if you eat, you're involved in agriculture. Of course you are. Today, however, a number of people who are directly involved in agriculture in the United States is somewhere around 3%. Okay? And that's not just farmers and ranchers. That's people who are in other facets of the economy. Perhaps they're farm laborers. Okay? So the agricultural sector of the economy is still huge, but doesn't take nearly as many people as it did even 20 years ago to do the same amount of work. So we're going to look at that. We're going to look at how agriculture went from being ubiquitous and sort of everyday drudgery for everybody to becoming something that is a little bit more specialized, a little bit more sophisticated. All right? So agriculture is really the focus of this chapter. We go from 1815, when the vast majority of Americans live on farms, to understanding how farming in different regions began to evolve, so that by 1860, there were very distinctive patterns of agriculture. Not everybody had a general farm. Not everybody was doing the same thing as they, not that they were necessarily in 1815, but farming was very subsistence-oriented in 1815, and by 1860, it would become less and less subsistence-oriented, more commercial-oriented. So that's kind of what we're getting at. Sort of the commercialization of agriculture and the impacts on that commercialization on the region. Now, you might look at, there are some terms in this chapter referring to the Old Northwest and the Old Southwest. The Old Northwest is that area that today we call what, for the most part?
Ohio.
Okay, well, yeah, I think it's included in terms of a big, broad region. The Midwest, for the most part. The Great Lakes, Midwest. Not so much the Great Plains, which today you would call Nebraska, and the Dakotas, a Midwestern state. In 1815, it was the far western frontier. The old Southwest, especially if you're from Oklahoma, to us, the Southwest is what? New Mexico, Arizona, right? In 1815, even 1860, the Southwest were the southern states, for the most part, west of the Appalachian Mountains. So Tennessee and Mississippi were southwest in these states. So be careful with those terms. Old Southwest, old Northwest mean different things here. And for the most part, the focus is on the West, the expansion of the country into the West. What allows that to happen? Infrastructure. So we'll talk a lot about infrastructure here. You'll read a lot about infrastructure if you haven't read it yet. Now, Earle refers to a couple of different types of growth, economic growth. Number one, he says that economic growth can mean a rising or increase in per capita income. And in that sense, throughout this period, 1815 to 1860, most free Americans, became wealthier than they had been in 1815. So there's cumulative wealth taking place. But more important is the second type of growth that occurs during this period. It's an increase in productivity and an increase in the infrastructure of the country that allows the expansion of opportunities into the West. So American economic geography begins to transform from something that was coastal to something that was more focused on the interior. This is the period when we begin to see something that we call regional economic specialization in the United States. The very first real economic specialization in a broad region. If we look at the three regions of the United States during this period, we might say there's a northeast, a northeast which would include New England and perhaps New York, maybe Pennsylvania. There's a south, and the southern part of the country, the southwest and the Atlantic coast, was a fairly distinctive region. Of course, these are differentiated because of slavery, right? So the free states are north of the Ohio River for the most part, and the slave states south of the Ohio. The economies really diverged from these two regions in the period. Then you have this more nebulous region known as the Great West, which is actually a reference to the Middle West or this Old Northwest, the Great West. So this was an area of expansion, and much of this chapter is about the expansion west by Southerners and by people originally from the Northeast into this Middle West area, and the challenges that came about. Now, this note here about Douglas North, page 166, reference to a motor of economic growth in that there were huge export surpluses created, creating markets for the Northeast and the Middle West. This is something that Earle generally disputes, and he makes a point on page 166 that you might look at about how the southern states had often been referred to as, they're the wealthiest individuals in the United States, the people who are bringing in wealth and generating markets. Okay, so he makes an argument. This is the argument that no. Number one, I'll switch over here to another page. You can see the next slide. That the populations of the South did not rely on the Middle West for food, as this argument goes, and that most Southerners did not import manufactured goods from the Northeast or the Midwest. They imported them from Europe. And that there is a much stronger link, and this is the important point, there is a really strong link that develops between 1815 and 1860 between the Middle West, the Old Northwest, Great Lakes states, and the Northeastern states, the New England and New York, Pennsylvania. And that strong linkage would lead to more alliances between the Middle West and the Northeast rather than between the Middle West and the South, political sense. So I'm going to go back to the previous slide now. Okay. So we're looking at economic growth, a spatial process that involves regional economic specialization, okay, and interregional trade. Earle is interested in understanding how these three regions were trading with one another during the period leading up to the Civil War. It does pivot largely on the question of slavery, the expansion of slavery into the West. And so they have a theory. They have a good idea or interpretation of these events, which we'll talk about. This idea that I'm going to present to you, that you've read about, is a traditional sort of economic development idea. It comes out of Walt Rostow's ideas of economic takeoff. This is, if you've had if you've been exposed to other interpretations of how development works or policies regarding economic development, Rostow is often, considered to be the old school, sort of the something that doesn't necessarily work in the 21st century. And for the most part, it probably doesn't work so well in the 21st century, but in the 19th and perhaps the first part of the 20th century, it had a lot of validity. Rostow's analysis of American economic takeoff, all right, is basically portraying the United States at this early stage, in this early period, as what Rostow refers to as sort of preconditions for takeoff, not the earliest stage of development, but sort of an intermediary stage in which things were kind of coming together in terms of natural resources and transportation and money, capital, okay, infusion of capital, to allow investment, both private and public investment, in transportation infrastructure. Okay. In geography, one of the most important things we examine is movement over the surface of the earth. So movement or transport, movement of goods, interaction between places. We have fancy words for it called things like spatial interaction, okay? But for the most part, we're referring to trade. And we're very interested in why and how places can exchange goods. How can they develop relationships? It's important stuff. Perhaps a lot of the peace that, sort of peaceful relations between countries is kind of ensured by strong trade. It's kind of dangerous when countries decide to stop trading with one another and decide that they're not going to have trade interaction to the same degree that they did in the past. Because when you shut out trade or end trade, there's not, you're losing one of the incentives to compromise and to work together. And I think if you're familiar with history and wars, you'll see that countries that don't trade with one another often wind up competing with one another and perhaps wind up at war with one So trade is a good thing. It's something that we want to understand. But in terms of the development of the United States, what's going on in this 1815 to 1860 period? Well, three primary forms of overland transport. We call it overland, even though sometimes they use water. Right? There's of course coastal transport and oceanic transport, which is based on sailing ships and later steamers. But the interior trade is going to be based on roads, canals, and railroads. Now, all of these things are invented, of course, by 1815, even the railroad. Where were railroads important in 1815 in the world?
Like the production centers in the north.
The Pennines, is that what you said?
Huh?
The Pennines? What did you say?
I said mines.
Mines? Oh, I'm talking about like a region of the world. Where was the railroad steam engine and or railroads? Where did they develop? Who invented them? What country? Yeah, the British. So the first railroads of the first railroad networks developed in England. Developed in the mines associated with moving coal and moving ore for the most part. Real small scale stuff, on the order of Disney World scale. Not very big at all. Not so much interregional. But in the United States, railroads would slowly blossom into something that not only allowed people in cities to move across the city pretty quickly, and people between major cities like Baltimore and Washington D.C. to maybe travel, or Philadelphia and New York to travel back and forth, but the scale of the railroad developed, and rather than just moving people, railroads began to move freight, right? And freight's hard to move because it doesn't pay so much. It's expensive. So moving freight is one of these things that we're interested in. Roads, canals, and railroads then are developed in this period through public and private investment. Somebody's got to pay for it. Somebody's trying to make money from it. And as these new developing forms of infrastructure emerge and connect with one another and become more efficient, more reliable, then you have this phenomena that happens, and it's a wonderful, wonderful thing, right? The cost of transport declines. The cost of moving people and moving freight, moving goods, declines. As the development grows, or as the systems improve, the technology gets better, the price of moving something declines. This also increases interaction within and across these regions. And it stimulates even more regional specialization. Okay, so I'm obviously emphasizing the blue ink here. All right? Whoops, that's a mistake, sorry. Go back. All right. So new modes of transport brought down transportation costs and increased interaction within the United States. Interregional exchange stimulated regional specialization as new production zones were created for new markets. That's a mouthful, but what does it mean? What are some examples from today? We're still living the same thing, It's still the same thing. What's going on? Somebody said something?
Silicon Valley.
What about Silicon Valley?
It's like the technology is right now where all of the market is like kind of pushed towards.
Okay. All right. What's the latest big tech corporation to decide it's going to build a new campus? They call them campuses now, not factories, not plants. Amazon recently, right? And have we decided on which city is going to be the landing place for this new Amazon campus?
Not yet.
Not yet. Are they down to a short list?
I think it's like 50 cities at this point.
50 cities. What are some of the possible cities? Detroit,
Newark,
Newark,
Boston,
Boston,
Atlanta,
Atlanta,
um,
the Stillwaters.
no,
No Stillwaters yet. So what's determining their decision? What's taking them so long?
they're waiting for some tax incentives.
They're waiting for tax incentives. Oh, surely not. You mean they can just bid out whatever they want to? They can just pretty much determine where they want to go.
Yeah.
They can make regions and cities beg,
Yeah.
like pathetic, desperate individuals. Okay, please, yeah, absolutely, yeah. And industries have been doing that for decades. It's just getting acceptable now, and even respectable, I suppose. But of course, why is that? Well, because of course, if you get the new Amazon campus, and actually Apple's going to do this too, right? Recently, Apple's supposed to, they're going to develop this new campus outside Cupertino, California. Can you imagine that Apple build, say Apple were to say, we really like the Oklahoma City Thunder, so we're gonna build our new campus in Oklahoma City, and we're going to move 4,000 employees from from Cupertino, from the San Francisco Bay Area to Oklahoma City. Wouldn't that be fun? What would that do to the housing market in Oklahoma City? It would get Californicated, wouldn't it? The price of homes in Oklahoma City would go through the roof because all of the Californians who can sell their 2,000 square foot home for $850,000 on average, okay, would wind up in Edmond, okay, and Edmond housing would go from $100 a square foot to probably $200 a square foot overnight, maybe more. And so anyway, this is obviously something that happens all the time, but this is, we started this with, I'm not sure exactly where we went with that, but it's showing development. It's related to development. If you want to go back to, this idea of connections, right? How does an innovation in transport, or we could say maybe communications, how does that lead to increased interaction? Increased interaction. Well, would we be ordering things from Amazon left and right without some other technological changes? What are the technological changes that even allow that to happen and make it economically sustainable?
Air freight.
Air freight. Okay, good. And what allows air freight to? Air freight and what else?
Parcel services.
The parcel services like UPS and FedEx. Okay, UPS and FedEx are moving these goods, right? And why didn't they exist 100 years ago? Well, they did sort of, in the sense that you could order a house from Sears and Roebuck, right? And it would come on a train after 2 or 3 weeks, and you would build it. But they weren't going to mess around with something like a pair of shoes, right? Nobody's going to order a pair of shoes. Well, they probably did back then. You're not going to order something because the price is not, the transport costs aren't going to be absorbed, right? It'd be too much.
Put it this way, you can do grocery shopping online now.
Absolutely, and have them delivered to your house. So the technology allows more interaction, allows more trade. All right, so that's enough problem. So increased interaction. There's an increase in interaction that increases trade, and that trade then allows greater regional specialization in whatever it is you're doing. There are other ways of doing this, but for the most part, we're going to look at how these regions kind of grow together through transport infrastructure and how these regions come to rely on one another more and more for trade. So here's Carville, Earle, and Ron Hoffman's model introduced in the, so you can't get away from the textbook without learning about their theory. But this is the staple theory of regional development. Staple theory refers to the dependence on a particular commodity, production of a particular commodity, usually referring to an agricultural commodity. Okay, so what is exactly an agricultural commodity? What's the difference between a resource and a commodity?
Commodity is more like luxurious, I guess. It's more like a luxury resource.
Well, I appreciate your vocalizing that. It really has not much to do with the sort of social status of it. Okay.
Exchange.
What?
You can exchange commodities.
Commodities can be exchanged. Okay, that's a good one.
I'd say that
Resource,
a resource is like a raw material.
maybe.
Like,
Yeah. Okay. Like what?
like coal, cotton.
All right.
Then
Coal can be a commodity as well as a resource, can it?
as long as it's valuable and can be sold.
So if coal, where would coal be if it's a resource?
In the ground.
In the ground and unextracted, right?
Right.
Natural gas. There's probably a lot of natural gas below us right here, right? But it's a resource. It's not a commodity until we have hold of it and we can move it and we can exchange it, right? So prairie hay growing out in the pasture, well, that's kind of a commodity, but you haven't harvested it yet. Maybe the soil that produces the prairie hay is not a commodity, right? But the commodity is something that's pretty much extracted or made sellable. It's made exchangeable. So commodities, think commodities. What are some commodities that are around the United States, being produced in the United States in, say, 1840?
Livestock.
Livestock. Where?
Chicago's famous livestock machine.
Okay. So people are producing cattle, producing pigs. The main type of main meat source for most Americans in the 1840s was what? Pork, exactly. Not beef, not chicken for sure. Chicken was that was a delicacy, but pork. And we'll see the development of areas that produce lots and lots of hogs, and then process those hogs, okay, process the livestock into pork products, okay, bacon and ham and sausages and pig skin, and those commodities then are shipped out. So there's an economic development in the sense of the commodities are transformed. Value is added to the commodity to make a more valuable product that could be sold, right? So that means that whenever we have industrialization, you've got to concentrate a commodity into a site, usually a city, and that site or that city then is involved in producing or adding value to the commodity and warehousing and probably exporting that commodity to other markets. So in the case of hogs, okay, people in Kentucky and Ohio and Indiana on the farms are raising lots of hogs, and they're taking them to places like Cincinnati and Louisville, where the hogs are fattened on corn, right? Fattened and then they're slaughtered, and the resulting pork products are then because they're what do you call it, preservable, right? Salted or cured. They're able to withstand transportation time and you can make a profit at that. So the value is being added in the cities in that particular processing. So agricultural processing is one of the most important types of industries that get started in the old Northwest, in this area that we're referring to as the Old Northwest, today's Middle West. All right, so let's go back to Earle and Hoffman. They recognize two functions in this development of regions based on staple products, all right? And we don't really even need to know each individual product. We just need to know the process. So there are what they call production functions, which involve people out on the farms and opening new land for farms. The input of labor to produce farm commodities, okay? Producing farm commodities, or it could be other things. It could be, in the case of lumber, timber and lumber, you've got to have labor to get out there and cut trees and work in sawmills to move the material from the timberland to the sawmill and from the sawmill to the market, etc. So there's labor involved. And then, of course, there's the degree of profitability. Degree of profitability has a lot to do with the natural environment. Right? What are some factors that would affect the profitability of producing lumber? Okay, and the environmental factors. You want to start a lumber business in South Dakota, western South Dakota? Well, maybe in the Black Hills, Nevada. Well, the Great Plains are probably not the best place to center your new lumber business, right? So you want to go to places like Minnesota, or Wisconsin, where there are a lot of forests. How about you want to be a cotton farmer? Well, where do you go?
Maine.
Don't go to Maine, right? And don't try to catch lobsters in Mississippi, right? So you want to produce the profitability of something is going to, of course, depend on the environment. Let's take a quick side note. Something that we'll see over and over again. The profitability of producing an agricultural commodity can actually become very, very high in certain specific areas. There are certain areas that become fantastically productive for one reason or another. It may be because of some accident of the environment making soils really, really good at producing a certain type of crop. Or it might be a combination of the climate and soils. It may also be that the accessibility of labor to that production system. Okay? Certain areas wind up having fantastic profitability, or what we might call sort of the efficiency of production. Anyway, and that's where a lot of the innovations take place. A lot of the innovations in agricultural technology or mining technology, they take place in these regions that are really strongly specialized. Right? Where would you expect to find some engineer coming up with some new petrochemical invention that allows you to have a cell phone battery that lasts a week or a month, right? Where would you expect to find that person? Say it's a petrochemical product. I doubt if it would be for a cell phone battery. Maybe a new plastic or something. Plastic that, I know, it's the time of year that our pipes freeze. If you're a homeowner, this is kind of, having your pipes freeze is an awful experience. I've had it happen. And, water pipes freeze, well, it gets really cold, and you have copper pipes, right? And your house just gets too cold or something. We weren't expecting the 20 below in Oklahoma. Anyway, the pipes freeze and water goes everywhere. Your house floods in the middle of winter. It's terrible. There's this new product. It's not really new, but maybe 10 or 20 years old. I don't know. And I can't remember the brand trade name of it, but it's plastic, and it's a plastic pipe. You know what it's called?
Pegs.
What's it called?
Pegs.
PEX. How do you spell that? P-E-X? Okay. Yeah, that's what it is. PEX pipe. So, and what does that do, Miles?
It expands.
It expands when it freezes, rather than like copper just splitting, right, and blowing water everywhere. It expands, and it'll expand like a lot, won't it? I mean, once it freezes, it gets really big. So what they do now is when your pipes freeze, you usually bypass it with PEX, excuse me, and you're pretty good to go there, hopefully. So, where did that, I wonder who invented that. I have no idea. My guess would be probably somebody in Houston, right? Or Baton Rouge, or someplace where the petrochemical industry is concentrated. So in other words, the innovations come from those places that have had the greatest, they're the places where the focus of all the effort and research and development takes place. Anyway, it's not anything new. All right, so somebody can look that up and let me know where PEX was invented. So this is this idea of production functions is pitted with marketing functions. Basically, how do you get material, or how do you get your commodities or your manufactured goods to the market? And the markets are always going to be oriented towards the cities, toward urban centers, right? And so the marketing functions, basically, that's what in geography we're really interested in that because we want to get something from here to there as efficiently and quickly as possible. Whether you're getting an agricultural commodity to the processing city, like the hogs to Cincinnati, or if you're getting the finished goods, let's say, let me get away from pigs, getting, say, sawn lumber from the sawmills in Duluth, Minnesota, to Chicago, where they're needed for the construction industry. So the movement of materials and the transport of materials is what they're referring to with this marketing function. All right. So there are a lot of factors, of course, that combine to make sense within a region. Then we've got sort of the demographics. So Earle discusses sort of the demographic differences from region to region. These might be a little bit more familiar to you, particularly if you've taken Geography History 3093, the precursor to this course. The labor requirements in different parts of the region, different parts of the United States, Western United States, were very different. Right? In the Middle West, as with New England, and much of the Middle West, particularly the area around the Great Lakes, as you might recall, was settled by New Englanders. New Englanders who went through New York, through upstate New York, along the Mohawk Valley, eventually through northern Ohio. Those Midwesterners, a lot of them came from New England, and then others came from Pennsylvania, right? But they were coming from a free soil, non-slaveholding region, all right? Free soil, non-slaveholding region. And in those regions, the primary way of life was farming. And if you were going to be a successful farmer, if you were going to survive as a farmer, you had better have plenty of help, right? And if you were on the frontier, for the most part, anywhere in the Middle West, where did your help come from?
Children.
Yeah, from your wife, right? And so people married young. They had children early, what we would call early, 14, 15. No. They had children early. They had as many children as they could. And of course, the mortality rate for infants and for children and for mothers was astronomical compared to what we would experience today, right? In fact, that's one of the newer demographic measures is maternal mortality, the number of women who die in childbirth, similar to the infant mortality rate around the world. But it's maternal mortality, infant mortality, child mortality were high. They weren't as high as in Europe, in much of Europe, but relative to today, we would be shocked. Okay, so they had a lot of kids, and if a farmer had 3 or 4 sons, to help with the heavy lifting and the farm work, and then maybe daughters. You'd also work with the mother doing things like processing dairy goods, making cheese and butter, and maybe also working doing other cash types of income. Farmers needed sons, so you had these in the Middle West. You had fairly large families, plenty of labor. That's what's going on here. The plantation South, not to say people didn't have plenty of children, they did, but in the South, labor was scarcer. It was not as available as in the Middle West, and it didn't have to do with the demographics as much as the type of work. All right. Now, in the plantation South, whether that's the tobacco plantation South or the cotton plantation South, most farmers aspired to be able to own slaves, because in a tobacco or cotton plantation production scheme, land was not that much of an issue in terms of expense, but labor was. And with a very high price for labor, slavery, which is only makes not making any sort of moral justification here, but it only makes a labor price justification if there is work to be done throughout the year. Okay, so this is why if you were producing tobacco and particularly cotton, there was so much work throughout the entire year that you could not afford to hire free labor.
At this point in time, was like the vast majority of land still with like the yeoman or the family farmer, or had it like switched to plantation?
Well, that's a great question. And you're talking about in the South?
Yes.
So let me rephrase the question so we can hear this later. The question was, in the southern states, what was sort of the regime? What was the sort of the pattern of agriculture? Were they general farmers, yeoman farmers, or were they plantation owners? That is a fantastic question, actually, because the answer is they were small farms, general farmers. Vast majority of people in the South did not own a slave. Okay, the vast majority of white farmers in the southern states, even into the Civil War, were not slave owners. Okay, and those people who did own slaves, the vast majority of those who did own slaves, owned 1 or 2, typically 1. Okay, the planters that had 10, 20 more slaves were a very small minority of the total population of the plantation South, tobacco or cotton. However, they had most of the political power. They were often the politicians as well. So they had, in very unequal or very large proportion of political influence and power. In fact, most Southern planters or farmers who maybe own one slave would, aspire to own more, because the more slaves, the more labor, the greater the profitability and the prospect for growth and for real wealth. It's a really good question. It's analogous to, Donald Trump often brags about starting from nothing, right? So if you all started from nothing, what he calls nothing, which was, I think, a loan of $1 million, okay? So if you just had $1 million, how many of us would be successful investors? I don't know. I probably wouldn't. I'd probably be investing in the cell phone batteries or something. But $1 million is nothing? No, it's not nothing. But if you can imagine having access to $15, $20 million capital to play around with, we're going to find something that'll work. I think we would. That's not the point here. The point, though, is that search for the holy grail of wealth in the South was labor for plantation work, and that was slavery. In the North, the holy grail for wealth was pretty much not much. There wasn't anything until the Industrial Revolution, and that would, of course, create wealth disparities, that were even much greater than even the South. Okay, so the Middle West then is this area that's undergoing settlement and development. Its form, and this is what Carville, Earle, and Hoffman make a big deal out of. They say that in the Middle West, the types of crops that they're producing basically involve fairly brief periods of labor. It's very intensive. And when you have intensive, brief periods of labor, you hire out the labor. Or you hire free labor, and you would never be able to justify slavery. And the type of crop he's referring to is the type that we find around, that migrates basically from the Mohawk Valley of New York to the Great Lake Plains, into northern Illinois, off into Wisconsin. And that crop is what you need to produce bread, right? Wheat bread. So the wheat belt, the development of the wheat belt during this first half of the 19th century was one in which, if you know anything about wheat farming, unfortunately I know way too much about wheat farming because I used to farm wheat. I used to drive a tractor in the summer, and it kept me out of trouble most of the time. But there are fewer mailboxes around Payne County because of my tractor driving, but that's only when we're moving influence. The thing about wheat production is, when is most of the activity taking place? Harvest, right? Harvest is crazy. You work around the clock if you could, because you've got to get the wheat in before the next rain comes or the weeds take it over. And you want to get it right when the moisture content allows you the greatest profitability at the mill. Okay, so it's all crazy around harvest time, but then after harvest, what do? Well, you're working you're disking and plowing and cultivating and fertilizing and then drilling or planting, and by the time you plant the crop in October or something, then it's pretty much life is easy because then you become a cattleman around here. Maybe after December or something, you might put cattle on it, and then take them off around March, and then March, April, May, it starts to get all nice and pretty, and you go for that around here early June flurry of work. Okay, so that's why in the Great Plains, they're developed this phenomenon that they call custom cutting. right? You ever heard of custom cutting? Anybody know any? Has anybody ever been on a wheat harvest? Maybe you only have. Okay, how far north did you make it?
I worked on a range in Western Oklahoma.
Oh, okay. All right. So you know about wheat harvest. But you know the wheat harvest on the Great Plains starts in West Texas and goes all the way up into northern Manitoba, Saskatchewan over time. So you start in like May and then you wind up in the late summer. And that custom cutting business is where basically these individuals have combines. They invest big time in big combines, grain trucks, and they go and they cut for the farmer. The farmer doesn't have to invest in those big things. So that's an example of sort of an innovation associated with a very specialized, quick labor situation. So very intensive. Plantation South, tobacco or cotton, particularly cotton. Most plantations were not just producing the staple crop. All right? Most plantations were actually quite varied in their production. All right? In fact, most plantations, if they were cotton plantations, didn't devote even half of their total land to the production of cotton. And that's kind of weird if you've ever been to southwestern Oklahoma or the panhandle of Texas, and you can drive for miles and miles in the summertime and see nothing but cotton, right? And there's no plantations. It's all mechanized stuff. It's basically a factory, producing cotton. But in a plantation setting where the labor is hand labor, it's not mechanized, there's a lot of other things going on to allow the plantation to function. In other words, land has to be cleared, land has to be worked, has to be cleared of timber, it has to be worked, it has to be drained sometimes. Livestock are usually produced. To feed livestock, you have to have feed crops, corn, oats, whatever. There's other types of skilled work that takes place on plantations prior to the Civil War. Okay? In fact, most of the southern plantations kind of served as places where people had, their specialized service needs performed. Things like blacksmiths lived on the plantations, okay, or they worked on the plantations. So you took your broken axle or whatever to the plantation to have it worked on. Specialized labor. So in the case of plantations, with all the things going on, lots of activity to support the plantation itself, this long-term need for labor was able to justify or economically rationalize slavery because it never would have functioned with free labor. Free labor wouldn't have allowed it. Okay, I think I've beaten that horse into the ground. Or beaten that dead horse, whatever you want to call it. All right. This is, I think, one of the last ones, so bear with me if you're really sick of yellow. Wage rates. How did this work then? This is what the so-called transfer wage is what Earle is really getting at. And what he says is that wage rates in rural regions, okay, of the Middle West or the South, basically dictated the type of development, the type of agriculture, the wage rates had a lot to do with the development of industry. Okay? And this is pretty fascinating stuff. Regional urban wage rates derived from the different types of agricultural crops in the regions. So, some of you maybe are Civil War historians. What were the industrial centers of the South during the Civil War? What places in the South manufactured arms or ordnance? And that's an appropriate response. pretty much. Richmond, Virginia had a little bit of industry. It was about the most industrialized part of the whole Confederacy. And Birmingham, Alabama, the area around Birmingham was known for producing what? Steel. It was kind of the Pittsburgh of the South, right? So Birmingham had foundries, and South Birmingham, what's the name of the town where the Confederate armory was? Can't remember. Sorry. Anyway, most of the Confederate armaments, were of lower quality than the North's, because the North had industry, it had steel industry. It had a long, old firearms industry based in Massachusetts, New York, primarily Massachusetts. Okay, so the firearms industries of the Northeast and the steel, developing steel industry and forges of the Northeast provided, the technological side of warfare for the North, which eventually overcame, perhaps a more dedicated, more vicious infantry on the southern side. Okay, and you can't say that the South didn't have better fighting personnel. It did, by far, and better leadership. But they didn't have the armaments, and they didn't have the ability to move people quickly like the North did. And they didn't have a navy to blockade either. So what we're getting at here is the development of industry largely followed the type of agricultural development that was developing in the West. Okay, and let's go back to that idea of wealth creation, right? Southerners knew how to get wealthy. They could get the land. The land was cheap. Labor was the trick. So the more slaves, the more wealth, for the most part. In the North, up in the wheat belt, right? Way up in the wheat belt around, let's say, northern Ohio, northern Indiana, northern Illinois, southern Wisconsin. Life on the farm was dull and never, would never make you wealthy. And for that, in that sense, people in the Middle West tend to be a lot more equal socially. There wasn't a lot of rigid hierarchies in Midwestern society prior to around 1840, 1850. People were all pretty much middle class to poor, right? But when industry started moving west, taking advantage of some of these new infrastructural technologies, these new transport technologies, when infrastructure started moving west, it located just like Amazon's doing now, right? It went to where it was going to make the most money, where it was going to make the most sense. The new industries of Chicago went to the wheat belt. The new industries of, let's say, Detroit, okay, or the new industries located in Detroit were in basically the wheat belt. Cleveland, okay? Cleveland would grow up a sort of a quasi-steel city, manufacturing city on Lake Erie, which was in the wheat belt. Right? There were reasons why industry located to those northern cities, not for the climate, not for the wonderful winters, okay? Certainly not for the beautiful fall, but But they went to those locations because labor was cheap. Free labor was cheap. Because all those farm families populated the area. Farm families had what we might call, and this is an awful term, a surplus of labor to offer. Where there was a surplus of labor in an entire region, that surplus of labor couldn't argue for very high wages, right? I mean, in Stillwater, where you've got half the population between 18 and 24, are you going to get a $12 an hour job at McDonald's? Or a $15 an hour job at a restaurant, or doing something else? Probably not. Okay? They don't have to pay you that. There's always 3 other people at the door waiting to put in their application, right? So that's the way it is. Up in the northern tier, the Midwestern states, they utilize that population surplus. Not only that, but then you get, in the 1840s, you get the arrival of the first big wave of immigration. Who in the 1840s? The Irish, exactly. The Irish start coming in, and the Irish, unlike the previous immigrants, say the Germans and perhaps the Scandinavians, unlike the Germans, the Irish tended to gravitate to the cities. They had lived on farms long enough in Ireland. They wound up going to the cities. They went to Cleveland, Chicago, Pittsburgh, New York, Boston, but they went to those big cities. And of course, they undercut the wages of the native, the native-born American laborers. So that particular cheap labor was a great boon for American industrialists prior to the Civil War. So you get these early developments of industry going on in the North. Wage rates had a lot to do with the development of industry, or early sort of incipient industries in the Middle West. Big wage advantage, and this so-called transfer wage is something we'll talk about next time. But for the most part, cities, industries in the Midwestern cities could count on lots of labor out there in the hinterland coming in to do the jobs. They could always make a better living in the cities than they could on the farms. In the South, on the other hand, you have a different situation. White farmers and planters earned relatively more than their northern counterparts. Okay, free labor was very scarce. It precluded manufacturers from the South for the most part. Wage rates in parts of the South were twice as high as up in the North. And Southerners were proud of that. Southerners looked at the Yankees as being sort of dogs that would work for nothing. And Southerners had a sort of a degree of pride in their liberty, in their personal liberty of not being a slave, okay, to labor. So anyway, Northern entrepreneurs could hire 2 to 3 Northerners for every Southerner. Okay, there wasn't a lot of back and forth migration. Southerners certainly weren't going to Chicago to work, right? And Chicago or Illinois farmers weren't going to the South to be slaves. Well, I think the timeout on the computer is telling us it's about time to go. So we will pick up with this. If you haven't finished the reading, go ahead and do that. And I'll show you some pretty pictures and maps next time, I promise. Okay? All right, thanks for being here. And see you Thursday.